Hello and welcome to another video on how to secure yourself financially. And in today's video, what I'm gonna do is to take a closer look at the financial statement ratios and calculations and understand that, for example, things like PE ratio or current ratio, or operating margins, all of this concept or phrases, uh, they are not appear on the financial statement. Why? Because these are metrics, ratios, or calculations used by investors to analyze a company. And as a general rule, these desirable ratios vary by industries. So, if a company has a debt to equity ratio 2 to 1, which is a gearing ratio, so it means that the company is taking more debt than, or the company is financing its operation with debt rather than its own resource. It is good or bad? Depends. So the debt to equity, according to Investopedia, okay, that after all is a metric or a ratio to evaluate is the financial leverage of a company by dividing is the total amount or the total liabilities by the shareholders equity. In this measure, the goal of this is to give you a degree of which to give you at which degree the company is financing its operations with debt rather than with its own resource. And when it mentioned about the gearing ratio, is a set of ratios or financial metrics that compare shareholder equity to company debt in various ways to see is the company's leverage and financial stability. And this is something that you can not only also apply for companies but also for individuals as well. Is to see and evaluate you the asset of your capital with debt in various forms. Okay, and debt or the credit receive several names, and that's one of the things that is confusing. So you have debt and then liabilities, and it is important to understand the concept of credits, debt, and liabilities. Okay, uh, so yeah, that's gearing ratios, which are metrics that are used to understand is the company's leverage and financial stability by looking at the company's shareholders equity and debt. Okay, so this debt to equity, okay, um, is also something interesting because with the debt equity, yes, you can compare is at which ratio this company is financing its operations with debt rather than with its own resource. However, even though that a higher DA or debt to equity ratio suggests more risk, a particularly low one may indicate that a business is not taking advantage of debt financing to expand. And that's, my friend, is something crucial, not only for business but also for individuals. It's important to measuring is how much debt are you taking here, uh, and when are you allocating that capital, okay, to improve your business, to improve your operations. or to finance overconsumption. Finance overconsumption. Uh, and most of the time, or recently on the US, they have financing is, or they promote, well, the most of the time citizens, US citizens, has promoted overconsumption. And I will argue, to play devil advocates here, is that each one of them, they barely know about where they are, at least the on the financial aspect, okay, and when all of these things comes in, because they inherit all of this power and influence systems, and they barely know about them, and that can be very dangerous to others. In any ways, so this is the debt to equity ratio. So uh, is one of the financial ratios and calculations used by investors to evaluate a company, and this ratio, or a desirable ratio, varies across industries. Okay, so we got this debt to equity. What it does is to measure the degree at which a company is financing its operation with debt rather than with its own resources. And it's not bad. For example, if a company have a higher debt to equity, in fact, what it suggests is that this is a risky company. However, a low debt to equity means, or that may indicate, that a business is not taking advantage of debt financing to expand. Okay, so extremes are uh, extremes are bad. Extreme can be bad, or most of the time are bad. So extreme can be bad uh, in all aspect of life, and particularly with the debt equity is that. So if you have a higher DA in a particular industry, that means that your company is at risk. Okay, or suggests that it is more risk that you're taking. However, if you're so perhaps you're not investing your debt into your business operations, or you are financing overconsumption. You know, you are financing overconsumption if you are an individual. But also, if you have a low debt to equity, it may indicate that a business or a person is not taking advantage of the debt financing to expand. So investor will often modify the DE ratio to consider only long-term debt because it carries more risk than short-term obligations. Okay? Okay, so investors modify is the DA, or this total amount of liabilities divided by the shareholders' equity, but it only considers is long-term liabilities as well as the shareholders' equity. Why? Because it's more risk, or it carry more risk, this long-term debt, than the short-term obligations. So example of this, example of long-term debt. Okay, example of long-term debt. Corporate bond, mortgage, term loans, convertible debt, debenture, government bond, student loans. Okay. Individual offering take a student loan to finance their education, and these loans can have long repayment terms and fixed a variety and variable interest rate. Vehicle loans, leasing. When purchasing vehicle, individual and business can take out loan with extended repayment period, often ranging from 3 to 7 years. Lease obligation. While not exactly debt, long-term lease obligations can have similar financial implications. Capital lease, for instance, are structured in a way that lease is essentially acquiring an asset over time and making payments similar to loan installment. Preferred stocks. While not traditional debt, preferred stock shares some characteristic with debt instruments. But I just want to know is this long-term debt. Okay, an example of long-term debt, or let me paraphrase this. Most common. Let me refine the prompt here. Most common example of long-term debt. Okay, mortgage, corporate bonds, government bonds, term loans, convertible debt, equipment financing loss, debtor, lease obligation, student loans, residential and commercial real estate loans, infrastructure bonds, project finance debt, retail bonds. Most common example of long-term debt include their years. So you have 30-year fixed mortgage, a common type of residential mortgage with a fixed interest rate and a repayment period of 30 years. 50 years fixed mortgage, 10-year treasury bond, corporate 10-year bonds, a long-term government bond issued by the U.S. Treasury with a maturity of 10 years, corporate 10-year bonds, convertible bond with 7-year maturity, term loan with 5 years maturity, student loan with 20-year repayment, residential real estate loan with 25 years repayment, commercial real estate loan with 20 years repayment, infrastructure bonds with 30 years maturity. So this is just couple examples of long-term debt that investors use when they evaluate a company using the DB, debt to equity, right? So these long-term assets, okay? So 30-year fixed mortgage or 15-year fixed mortgage, 10-year treasury bonds, corporate 10-year bonds, convertible bond with 7-year maturity, term loan with 5-year repayment, student loan with 20-year repayment, residential real estate loan with 25-year repayment, commercial real estate loan with 20 years repayment, infrastructure bond with 30-year maturity, preferred stock. So these are residential real estate loan and commercial real estate loan. So these are just example of how investors use or they focus on long-term debt rather than short-term debt because long-term debt carry more risk. Okay, so that makes a lot of sense of the debt to equity rate, right? You have the total amount of liabilities, particularly the total amount of long-term liabilities, divided by the total shareholders' equity. And they follow this formula, right? the balance sheet formula. Mhm. And a highly leveraged and risky investment. Let me take a closer look at this. Oh, come on, man. For real? I'm gonna add this ad blocker.
The debt-to-equity ratio is a measure of a company's financial leverage. Al
No,
and
man.
Ed
No.
both go to the bank for business
annoying me.
loans. The loan officer looks at their
You're
respective
annoying.
balance sheets.
You're annoying.
Ed has $120,000
You're
in
annoying.
assets, cash, equipment, and so on. Ed also has $100,000 in liabilities, mostly loans. So Ed's equity is $20,000.
I would like to, but right now I don't
Ed's
have
liabilities
money
by his equity to come up with a
But when
ratio of
I
5.
got
This
it,
means Ed has
I do.
$5 of debt for every $1 of equity. Ed is highly leveraged, so he's a
Okay.
The debt-to-equity ratio is a measure of a company's financial leverage. Al and Ed both go to the bank for business loans. The loan officer looks at their respective balance sheets. Ed has $120,000 in assets, cash, equipment, and so on. Ed also has $100,000 in liabilities, mostly loans. So Ed's equity is $20,000. The loan officer divides Ed's liabilities by his equity to come up with a ratio of 5. This means Ed has $5 of debt for every $1 of equity. Ed is highly leveraged, so he's a high risk for the bank. His application is declined. Al's balance sheet is much stronger. Al has $150,000 in assets and only $50,000 in liabilities. His equity is $100,000. Al's debt-to-equity ratio is 0.5, $50,000 over $100,000. This means Al has 50 cents of debt for every dollar of equity. Al's low debt-to-equity ratio makes him a low risk for the bank. His application is approved. The debt-to-equity ratio identifies companies that are highly leveraged and therefore higher risk. But no single ratio can tell the whole story.
Exactly.
Debt-to-equity is one of the many metrics that investors use to evaluate a stock.
Exactly. No single metric can tell you the whole story. And this is something important to understand. So no single ratio can tell you the whole story. All right. All right. So for example, debt to equity. Okay. To calculate the debt to equity using Yahoo Finance balance sheets. Using financial statement from Yahoo Finance website data. Access the balance sheet with the financial statement section located on balance sheet or consolidate balance sheets. So if I go to Finance Yahoo, that's right. Because now it's time to put that at practice. Okay, let me take a closer look at Tesla, for example, or Apple. Apple, as well as Amazon, man. as well as Amazon. Okay. So access to and locate balance sheets or consolidate balance sheets. So when I look at the financials from Apple as well as from Amazon here, and I look at the balance sheets, I click on the balance sheet on Amazon as well. Okay, so what is the next step? Find total debt. Look for the line item that represents the company total debt or long-term liabilities. This line item is typically listed under liabilities on the balance sheet. And find total equity. Okay, find total debt, but long-term. Total liabilities. Total non-long-term debt, like this. Long-term debt. Okay, as well as long-term debt. As well as long-term debt. Long-term debt. So long-term debt, okay, and then find total equity. Locate the line item that represents the company total equity or shareholders equity. This line is typically listed under shareholders equity on the balance sheet, and then calculate debt to equity ratio. Once you have the value from the total debt and total equity, you can use the following formula. So total debt and total equity. Inputs the value you found in step 4 and find the formula to calculate the debt to equity. So if I, for example, take the long-term debt from, and then we also locate that total equity here, from here, stockholders equity, I'm assuming it's that, okay, shareholders equity, yep, shareholders equity, the total equity or shareholders equity, which is it, the shareholders equity. So if I take this amount, okay, 98 million, this is expressed all in thousands. Okay, so if I take this amount, 98, 98, 959, 98, 959, 98, 959, okay, divide by the share stockholders equity, which is 5672. This gives me a debt to equity of 1.95. So this is the debt to equity for Apple. Okay, this is the debt to equity from Apple. And when I look at the Amazon here, from the period of 2022 annual, let me measure the annual. That's right, annual as well as annual. Okay, if I look at the long-term debt and I apply the same, okay, so I get this amount divided by the stockholders equity. Specifically, the long-term debt is this. Long-term debt. So long-term debt and the stockholders, like this, stockholders equity. So you get is this 0.95, meaning that Apple is highly leveraged, is more leveraged than Amazon. Question is, what is the desired ratio in technology companies? You know, what is the desired ratio? What is the desired debt to equity ratio in tech companies? A refresher on debt to equity. This is from Harvard. Okay. Debt to equity ratio in tech company. Generally, a good debt to equity ratio is anything lower than one. A ratio of 2 or higher is usually considered risk, according to Fortune Builders. A current ratio. But this is for companies that are public, my friend. This is for companies that are public. So generally, a good debt to equity is anything lower than 1. A ratio 2 or higher is usually considered risk. So for example, Apple is financing most of its operations through debt rather than Amazon. And this is just an example of this. And this is just an example of this. And this is just an example of this. So with that, that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.